Another year wasted on your little internet venture. Gerald Whitman's voice boomed across the long candlelit dining table, drawing the attention of nearly every guest. I thought we raised our son to marry someone with ambition. I carefully set my wine glass down, feeling Ethan's hand squeeze my knee beneath the table. We were at the annual Whitman family Thanksgiving dinner in their sprawling Connecticut estate, a night that had become more about endurance than celebration, ever since I married into this family of old money bankers 4 years ago. Actually, the business is doing quite well, I said calmly, keeping my tone even. Our customer base has seen substantial growth this year. Lucille Whitman, my mother-in-law, arched a perfectly drawn-on eyebrow. How many soy candles and knitting kits did you manage to sell this month, darling? The condescension in her voice stung, but I kept my smile polite. If only they knew. What they called my internet hobby was merely the surface of Lena's Lane, the brand. Beneath that branding was Archetype Commerce, one of the fastest-growing white-label e-commerce infrastructure firms operating in Southeast Asia and Europe. "Leave Lena alone, Mom," Ethan said. Though his voice wavered, the Whitmans had a talent for making even their own children feel 2 inches tall, especially when the discussion shifted to status and career paths. "We're just worried," Gerald said as he sliced into his roasted duck. "Lena's a smart woman, graduated from Stanford with honors. She could be doing something real, a career at Whitman Holdings, for instance. Instead, she's running a digital souvenir shop." I thought about the confidential documents locked away in my home office, papers formalizing tomorrow's partnership announcement. Whitman Holdings, for all its polished history, was losing ground fast in the fintech race. Their leadership believed acquiring Archetype Commerce would be their ticket to relevance. If only they knew who owned it. "Speaking of careers," Lucille chimed in, turning to Ethan, "we're all so proud you're in line for a managing director role next quarter. Finally, some real success in the family." Ethan shifted beside me, swallowing hard. He was proud of me, one of the few who knew the full scope of what I'd built. Only he, my attorney, and my COO were aware of my ownership. "That's great news," I said sincerely. "I'm truly proud of you." "Yes, well," Gerald raised his glass, "at least one of you appreciates real business. Banking is the backbone of this country, not these overnight online fads." I bit my tongue, thinking about last week's meeting with Carl Monroe, CEO of Whitman Holdings, who had sat across from me in a private conference room, practically begging Archetype to consider their buyout offer. Their legacy infrastructure was decades behind, and they knew it. "More wine, Lena?" Lucille asked, her smile tight. "You must need it spending all that time with, what do you call them, internet celebrities?" "Influencers," I corrected gently. "And no thank you. I have an important meeting in the morning." "Oh," Gerald's tone was syrupy and insincere. "Another digital pop-up shop?" "No," Ethan spoke up, his voice firm now. "It's a meeting with your board of directors, Dad." The room went silent. Gerald's fork hovered mid-air. "What are you talking about?" "Lena's been asked to consult on Whitman Holdings' digital transformation strategy," Ethan explained, giving me a subtle, proud wink, given her experience in global e-commerce. "Absolutely not," Gerald snapped. "Carl wouldn't." "He already did," I said, my smile finally reaching my eyes. Tomorrow, they'd learn just how real my business truly was. "Would never, the board wouldn't," Gerald stammered. "The board would," I said evenly. And they did. In fact, Mr. Monroe personally requested I attend tomorrow's meeting. Lucille let out a shaky laugh. "Surely, there's been some kind of misunderstanding. No offense, dear, but what could a small online retailer possibly offer a major financial institution?" I smiled. "You'd be surprised what e-commerce teaches you, Lucille. For example, did you know that more than 70% of all banking transactions now happen online? Or that traditional banks are losing millions of customers to digital-first competitors?" "That's ridiculous," Gerald scoffed, but his eyes told a different story. Fear. He knew I was right. "Whitman Holdings has been serving clients for over a century," he barked. "We're not going to be replaced by some trendy app." If he only knew. Archetype Commerce had processed more transactions in October alone than Whitman Holdings had in the past 12 months. Their acquisition offer had been pitched as a rescue plan, disguised as a merger. They thought they were absorbing me. They had no idea I was preparing to absorb them. Times change, Gerald, I said softly. The only question is, do we change with them or get left behind? The rest of dinner passed under a strained silence, broken only by Lucille's awkward attempts to steer the conversation toward country club memberships and Ethan's potential promotion. As we prepared to leave, I heard Gerald pull Ethan aside for what he thought was a private conversation. "Control your wife?" he hissed. "It's bad enough she wastes her time with that internet nonsense, but now she's interfering in real business? Fix this, Ethan, or your nomination for managing director might not go through." The drive home was silent at first, until we were well past the rows of gated estates and manicured hedges. Then Ethan burst out laughing. "Did you see Dad's face when I mentioned the board meeting? I thought a blood vessel was gonna pop." I smiled, gripping the steering wheel a little tighter. "Just wait until he finds out who really owns Archetype." "How much longer do we keep this secret?" Ethan asked, turning down the private gravel road that led to our lakefront property, the one his parents assumed we could barely afford. I checked my watch. "About 14 hours. Meeting starts at 9. Ethan shook his head in disbelief. 3 years of smug comments, eye rolls, and whispered jabs at your little online shop. And tomorrow they find out you're the one keeping their company from digital extinction? "Not owning them," I corrected. "Saving them. Whitman Holdings is 3 months away from digital bankruptcy. They just don't realize it yet." In my home office, I unlocked the safe and pulled out the real acquisition documents. Not the ones their legal team had drafted, the ones my legal team had finalized. The terms were clear. Archetype Commerce would take controlling interest. Whitman Holdings would be restructured under our tech-forward strategy. Leadership positions would shift. And the Whitman family? They'd no longer be calling the shots. My phone buzzed, a message from Carl Monroe. "All set for tomorrow, full board in attendance, ready when you are." I ran my fingers across the embossed Archetype logo on the folder. "Thank you, Gerald," I whispered. "You taught me exactly how not to run a modern company." Ethan appeared in the doorway with 2 champagne flutes. "To tomorrow?" I took one, letting the moment settle in. "You know what's funny?" I said. "If they'd actually paid attention to Lena's lane, the site design, the custom payment flow, the analytics dashboard, they might have figured it out." "But they didn't," Ethan said, grinning. "Because they were too busy underestimating you." "Exactly. The processing system, the customer interface, the analytics dashboard. It's all Archetype technology," I said, sipping my champagne. "I've been showing them the future of digital commerce for 3 years, but they were too busy looking down their noses to recognize it." Ethan shook his head. "That's my parents. So obsessed with tradition they can't see innovation, even when it's sitting across from them at the dinner table." Outside, the lake shimmered under the moonlight, still and quiet. But by tomorrow morning, that calm would shatter. The halls of Whitman Holdings were about to be hit by a wave of truth no one saw coming. And Gerald Whitman was about to learn that sometimes the most disruptive forces don't wear pinstripes, they wear ambition. At 8:45 a.m., I stood at the floor-to-ceiling windows of the Whitman Holdings boardroom, watching downtown Hartford stir awake. The room smelled like aged leather and formality. Mahogany-paneled walls, oil paintings of dead financiers, and chairs meant more for legacy than comfort. Board members filed in one by one, murmuring polite greetings. Then came Gerald. He stopped dead in the doorway when he saw me, his face clouding over. "What is she doing here?" he demanded. "This is a closed board session." "Good morning, Gerald," I said evenly. "Mr. Monroe invited me." "Carl?" he barked, turning toward the CEO, who was calmly arranging presentation materials. Carl Monroe didn't flinch. "Actually, Mrs. Whitman's presence is essential today." Gerald's jaw clenched. "But she's not. She's just—" "Robert," came another voice. Lucille, still in her tennis whites, breathless from rushing. "What's going on? You said this was urgent." She stopped cold when she saw me, her eyes widened. What is she doing here? Please, everyone, take your seats, Carl said, his tone brisk. We have a lot to cover. The tension was electric. Gerald and Lucille took their usual seats beside the CEO, both of them exchanging glances that tried to conceal their unease. As many of you know, Carl began, Whitman Holdings has been working aggressively to modernize our digital infrastructure. 3 months ago, we entered acquisition talks with Archetype Commerce, one of the fastest-growing digital platforms in e-commerce and fintech. Gerald puffed up. This was his pet project, the deal he thought would cement his legacy. This morning, Carl continued, I'm pleased to announce the acquisition has been approved. Oh! The board clapped, a few smiling politely. However, Carl added, there have been some adjustments to the terms. Gerald frowned. Adjustments? What adjustments? The terms were finalized. Carl nodded toward me. Perhaps Mrs. Whitman would like to explain. All eyes turned to me. I stood, smoothing the sleek gray suit Lucille once mocked for looking off the rack. 3 years ago, I began, I founded a company called Archetype Commerce. It started as a platform for small retailers to launch online storefronts, but within a year we expanded into payment processing, digital banking, and secure fintech architecture. Gerald blinked. That's not possible. Lena's Lane. Your online shop? Was a test platform, I continued. Every sale, every customer, every support ticket, it all fed real-time data into our engine. We weren't selling candles, we were building the most powerful e-commerce system in the world. I clicked a remote. Screens lit up with charts and dashboards, transaction volumes, user adoption, real-time growth curves, cross-market integration stats. Archetype's numbers dwarfed anything Whitman Holdings had produced in the last decade. Last year alone, I said, Archetype processed over $18 billion in global transactions, and now we're absorbing Whitman Holdings, not the other way around. The silence was instant and complete. Gerald's face drained of color. Lucille looked like she'd swallowed her tennis visor. And we were just getting started. Continued, I said, as Lucille gripped Gerald's arm for balance, her face pale. Archetype processed over $300 billion in transactions last year alone. We have more than 200 million active users in over 60 countries, and our digital banking infrastructure now handles more daily transactions than all traditional banks combined. Impossible, Gerald muttered, his voice barely audible. The color had drained from his face. You sell crafts online. You're just... No, Gerald, I said, my voice steady. I built a digital empire while you were too busy mocking my hobby to see what was right in front of you. I nodded to Carl, who began handing out folders to each board member. Archetype Commerce isn't being acquired by Whitman Holdings, I continued. We're acquiring you. Chaos broke out. Chairs scraped, papers flew open, voices rose in disbelief. Lucille looked like she might faint. But Gerald? He just sat there, staring at me like he'd never seen me before. Carl raised his voice above the noise. The terms are generous. Whitman Holdings will retain its name, but operations will fully integrate with Archetype's infrastructure. Every current employee will keep their role, though there will be some adjustments in executive leadership. This is outrageous, Gerald snapped, finally finding his voice. The board would never approve this. They already did, said Eleanor Walsh, the board's longest-serving member. We've reviewed Archetype's systems, growth, and financials. Gerald, this isn't just an acquisition. It's a rescue. A rescue? Lucille gasped. Yes, I said gently. Your systems are outdated by a decade. You're hemorrhaging clients to digital-first competitors. Without this merger, Whitman Holdings would be insolvent in less than a year. Gerald slumped in his chair. The fight drained from him. How did we not know about Archetype, about you? I looked at him, thinking of every dinner party, every forced smile across a linen-covered table. You did know, I said. You just never bothered to look. Every time you dismissed my little website, you were mocking the very platform you were now begging to acquire. The next few hours passed in a blur. Signatures, legal briefings, press coordination. By late afternoon, the news broke. Digital titan Archetype Commerce acquires Whitman Holdings in historic fintech deal. Ethan found me in my new office that evening, once Gerald's, now freshly renamed and redesigned. He leaned on the doorframe, grinning. "Mom locked herself in the country club spa," he reported. "Dad's telling anyone who will listen that this was his idea all along, some strategic pivot." I chuckled, standing by the window. How long until they realize? About the same time they figure out my board nomination wasn't for Whitman Holdings, but for Archetype. My phone wouldn't stop buzzing. Journalists, congratulations, podcast invitations. The headlines practically wrote themselves. Underestimated. Daughter-in-law secretly builds fintech empire. From candles to corporate takeover, the Archetype revolution. The next morning, Lucille finally called me, livid. Her country club account had been flagged for migration. Turns out, their payment processor had been quietly acquired by Archetype 3 weeks prior. "I can't log in," she hissed. "Don't worry," I said sweetly. "We'll get you set up with a new digital banking app. I hear Lena's Lane has excellent customer service." Over the next year, Whitman Holdings was transformed. We preserved its heritage, its iconic name, its generational trust, but rebuilt it from the inside out. Paper files became encrypted archives, branches became digital hubs, and the bank that once sneered at online commerce became a global leader in secure, agile, modern finance. Gerald and Lucille slowly accepted the new reality, though I don't think they ever fully recovered from discovering their hobbyist daughter-in-law was now technically their boss. They still attended family dinners, but Lucille had stopped giving me career advice. As for me, I kept Lena's Lane running. It's still the best testing ground for new features, and someone has to keep selling the candles Lucille loves to mock. Ethan earned his seat on Archetype's board based on merit, not his last name. Sometimes I catch Gerald staring at the Archetype logo now shining atop the old Whitman building, still trying to understand how he missed the future that had been sitting right across from him. My office now holds a blend of past and future. Old Whitman ledgers shelved beside cutting-edge fintech dashboards. Awards for traditional excellence next to trophies for disruptive innovation. Because sometimes success isn't loud. It's built quietly, persistently, while others underestimate you. And sometimes the best revenge isn't proving them wrong. It's saving them from their own outdated beliefs. If my story resonated with you, if you've ever been underestimated, dismissed, or told your dream was just a hobby, I'd love to hear from you. Leave a comment. Tell me what you're building quietly, what you've kept working on while others weren't paying attention. I read every word. Because I was you, for 3 years I sat at family dinners listening to polite condescension, brushing off questions about my little online business, all while building something they couldn't begin to imagine. If you've ever felt the weight of silence while dreaming loud in your own mind, know this. Your time is coming. Don't quit. Don't shrink. Keep showing up for your vision, even when no one claps yet. And if you believe in people who bet on themselves, stand with me. Share this story. Let it reach someone else who's quietly building a legacy. Here's my advice. You don't have to prove anyone wrong to be right. You don't need permission to be powerful. Success doesn't have to be loud. It can rise quietly in the background step by step while the world looks away. So trust yourself. Build anyway. Let your work speak. Because sometimes the best way to change the game is to stop asking to play theirs and build your own.